Good evening. On behalf of the California Academy of Sciences and City Arts and Lectures, I would like to welcome you to the first lecture of Conversations at the Herbst Theatre Lecture Series. There is almost no aspect of modern life and living that has not been touched in some way by the personal computer, the invention that has revolutionized for the world's masses the acquisition, interpretation, storage, transmission, exchange, the use and abuse of information. Tonight it will be our great pleasure to sit in conversation with one of the founders, perhaps the founder, of that revolution, Steve Wozniak. Popularly known as Woz, the Wizard of Woz, Steve Wozniak in 1975, after I understand founding San Francisco's first dial-a-joke line, not sure if that's true or not, in collaboration with his high school friend Steve Jobs, produced the first fully functional microprocessor board for personal use, the venerable Apple I. The two then founded the company Apple in 1976, and the rest, as they say, is history. Since that time, Woz has gone on to complete his engineering degree at Cal, founded several more companies, all very interesting and technologically innovative, and has received at least 3 honorary doctoral degrees from North Carolina State University, Kettering University, and one of my alma maters, Nova Southeastern University. In some ways, perhaps most significantly of all, he's a leader in the arena of philanthropy, and to my mind, one of his most wonderful local contributions has been key to the development of the Children's Discovery Museum in San Jose. A longtime staple of our programs here at the Herbst, Roy Eisenhart, will be interviewing Steve Wozniak this evening. Roy is a favorite who has interviewed other technological and scientific luminaries such as Steve Wolfram, Craig Venter, and many others. His tact and skill at guiding the conversation is much welcome this evening, and therefore, without further ado, I introduce to you Steve Wozniak and Roy Eisenhart.
Thank you. Welcome.
May the best man win.
Well, not a tic-tac-toe. I read about your software program you wrote to prove that tic-tac-toe was only winnable if you knew the psychology behind it.
Yeah, when I taught 10-year-olds, I taught them how to program the game of tic-tac-toe. Actually, more when they were 11 and 12. But it's a game of logic. You can't lose tic-tac-toe if you follow a set of logical rules. Everyone knows that. But actually, you can beat people who believe they can't be beaten at tic-tac-toe. You can beat them with psychology, playing a tricky little sequence that usually tricks them.
Yeah. Well, the centerpiece of our discussion tonight, I think, will be around your book that you recently published, iWoz, a terrific book about a lot of the history that was described in the introduction. And because there's such an incredible amount of information that we could get into, if we had about 7 or 8 hours, if we were C-SPAN, we could probably cover the book. I've tried to narrow our expectations, and frankly, I find the last chapter in the book to be the one that carried me away with so much content. But what we're going to do is we're going to build up to that last chapter, which you call the rules to live by. So, since those rules to live by are essentially intended for young men and women who are your age and their late teens, early 20s, who want to be innovative, want to be engineers. I'd like to develop your early origins in that field, how you went through it, and then we'll loop through and finish with that final chapter.
Gosh, yeah. Just tell me when.
Go when.
Yeah, I was kind of,
Ready, set, go.
Growing up, Silicon Valley. I mean, the big deal treat was coming up to San Francisco once in a while, and it was so different. The streets, it was crowded, good place to visit, but never to live. Later in life, I learned it's a good place to live because you know all the shortcuts and where to go and how to drive and where to park. We grew up in Silicon Valley, but it wasn't called Silicon Valley. It was called Santa Clara Valley, full of trees and orchards. And there were enough engineers moving into Lockheed. Lockheed was really almost the heart of the silicon industry because only the military could afford to buy these brand new parts, the newest transistors, the high-speed transistors, and eventually 6 transistors on a chip. Silicon started growing. My dad was close to that. He was right in the heart of it. Took me to shows here at the Cow Palace. I'd go to a Westcon show, and people, maybe it was Gordon Moore himself, would hold up a picture of 6 transistors on a piece of silicon that they were going to make. And how could I be so lucky to get to go through such transitions in technology? A lot of other engineers in the area, so I grew up on a street with a whole bunch of electronic kids. And, we'd go do weeding in the neighbor's yard, and then we'd ask to go into their garage and look at their little mayonnaise jars full of resistors and capacitors, and we'd pick out the ones that looked cool, even though we couldn't necessarily build anything with them. That's how we wanted to be paid. So I had all these electronic friends, and we would come up with projects and build little sound makers and hook up wires between our houses and have intercoms and all that. And so it's like early on, we sort of knew inside, we knew that we were electronics. That was going to be our life. I'll bet every one of us is doing that to this day.
You mentioned 6 transistors on a chip as though it's kind of like it flows off your tongue, but at that time, even the concept of a transistor was pretty brand new. Right?
Well, Shockley developed the transistor out at AT&T in New Jersey, and then for some reason he decided to leave and come out to Mountain View. Set up Shockley Labs. Out of Shockley Labs, some engineers, eventually they were having trouble building the part he was trying to build. Some engineers left, kind of rebelled, and formed companies like Fairchild, Raytheon, Rheem, and I was kind of familiar with all these companies through my father telling me what they were doing. Every once in a while he got me down for a tour, and I saw the guys in their white coats, and this was the highlight. I mean, I was lucky to have such an early start. Now, my dad didn't push electronics on us. We had 3 kids in the family, and I'm the only one who turned out electronic. But I fell in love with it, and whenever I had a question, how does a transistor invert a signal from zeros to ones? How does it change electrons from negative to positive? How does it route them? Where do they flow? He would sit down on a blackboard and draw charts and show me how these little transistors could make the parts of logic, the parts that build computers. Yeah. So a very, very good patient teacher. Mm-hmm. And he'd also sit down a lot of times and talk to me about values in life and what kind of people we are. And to this day, I find that those are my own values.
You talk a lot about honesty.
Yeah, he talked a lot about honesty, that basically you are who you present yourself, and people know you, and if you can't keep your word to someone, it's got to be serious. I mean, a comedian, everything a comedian says has to have some kind of a story, a lie, some kind of phony thing. But if it's not for comedy's sake, you have to present yourself, you have to tell the truth. As a matter of fact, committing a crime, if you went into a court and you swear, it's more important to tell the truth than the crime. It would be a bigger crime to tell a lie than the actual crime you committed. And we grew up with that kind of strict adherence to this principle of truth.
Then a lot of this creativity that you more or less had around you, almost a matter of natural selection, you started expressing yourself through science fairs.
Yeah, that was very lucky because, I don't know if I would have wound up mathematical, scientific, electronic, if I hadn't had early successes in school. The first one was actually when my mom worked some flashcards with me the day before we did them in class in 3rd grade. I beat the girls, and everybody was making a big deal about a boy beating the girls. Right then and there, I said, somehow this is what I am inside. This is the core of Steve Woz. I'm good at math. Computers were so unknown back in the early 60s that the teachers figured, you're more than a rocket science, and they thought I was really bright and gave me straight A's, but, I fooled them. But, and that's where I built the tic-tac-toe computer. Yeah, 6th grade, just pounding nails into wood, soldering transistors to the nails, and hooking up hundreds and hundreds of transistors. And every transistor was one little rule that you could devise yourself if you played every game of tic-tac-toe on paper. If there's an x in square 1, and there's an x in square 2, and there's nothing in square 3, that's the square you take. That's a simple set of rules. So, and it was hundreds and hundreds of parts. And, you build a project that's so huge, it really prepares you, I think, for engineering, for knowing that you've got to have an end goal that you're not going to get to in an hour. You're not going to get to it today. You're not going to get to it tomorrow. You're going to work and work and work and put pieces together and solder them, and eventually you wind up with a completed project. And I think those huge science fair projects really helped me. I had one in 8th grade that right here in San Francisco, won huge awards. Won me the award for best electronics project in the whole fair. It was a little device that could add numbers in binary, ones and zeros. Everybody thought back then computers are totally non-understandable. They're in the highest departments of research in colleges. The military knows about computers, but computers work on ones and zeros. Good Lord, as human beings, we work on 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So ones and zeros are actually easier. And I was delighted in 5th grade to learn that, gosh, I can do all this 1 and 0 stuff and understand it. I don't need calculus. I don't need differential equations. I don't need trigonometry. Yeah. And I said, this is the thing I want to do for life. I'll never do it as a job. Because back then, engineers built things that were real, like TVs and radios, or whatever computers were. I don't know who does those, but it's not a job. That's true. That's exactly what I thought all the way through high school.
Well, but interestingly, we tend to think of those things as complex, and the more complex they are, probably the better they are. But your philosophy was to work from complexity to simplicity.
Yeah, at first, I started out, I got a ham radio license when I was 10 years old, and you bolt together all the metal, and you put the tube sockets and solder the wires and the resistors and capacitors. When you're done, you can sit there with a Morse code key after you've taken all the appropriate tests and everything, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. You can make your connections with other states, far away. Boy, what a hero, what a feeling of power. After I did it about 3 times, I really didn't. I was just a 10-year-old, and all these old techie people talking politics all the time. I didn't really want to converse with them much, but I don't know. What was I going to say? I know that the technology...
Well, we were talking about going to simplicity.
Simplicity. But then I'm just building stuff that exists. Now I start designing my own stuff for the big science fair projects, and to some extent I tried to make them simple, but really pretty much they were straightforward. I got to high school, and here's what happened. I had an electronics teacher, Mr. John McCullum, and he had one of the greatest electronic labs any high school ever had, better than all the local colleges. He had so much equipment. He had talked the school into buying cheap, inexpensive kits for things like meters, oscilloscopes, signal generators, and he had the kids in the early days of that school build the kits up. I got there the 4th year of this school. Pretty much all the schools I went to in my life were brand new. They were building everything and tearing down the orchards. But when I got there, we had complete labs. We had a course. Mr. McCullum wrote the lesson plans himself that progressed to where you would learn how electricity goes through a resistor, and then you'd learn how electricity goes through a capacitor and a coil. Now you could combine the two and make tones and circuits like that and work your way up to radios. He saw that I knew all the electronics. So he said, tell you what, Steve, I can arrange for you to go to a company and program a computer. I've got an engineer friend at a company. He'll let you come in once a week and write computer programs. Computer, my heart started thumping. Computer was this far-off word that you sort of imagined nobody ever got close to. We didn't have them in our school, so went down once a week, and I learned how to punch out some cards. You type on a key, you type a program into a card punch, and you get these little cards with holes in them and feed them into the computer, and the computer understands it and prints out the results. So one of the early things I tried to do was so much fun. I said, wow, I'll do a chess problem of the knight that has to bounce around the chessboard and hit every single square exactly once and never twice. And it's called the Knight's Tour. So I wrote a program to do it, and nothing came out. The engineer shut the computer off, kicked me off after about 20 minutes of waiting. He says, well, sometimes programs just get in loops. They do the same thing over and over, and they never get out. They never finish. They freeze. So I went back the next week, and I had it print out my chessboards, and I finally looked at them and said, it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. And then I ran a little calculation. It wasn't going to get an answer for 10 to the 25th years. And, I didn't realize it right away, but I thought it was so much power, a computer that can do 1 million things a second. Yeah. And a human being, I thought, how long can a human being can only, if it counted one number a second, it would take, I calculated it would take like 2 weeks to count to 1 million. This computer does 1 million things per second, and yet it couldn't solve that problem in the time the universe has been around, which means you need some clever brain approach to problems too.
Yeah.
How can you get the most output for the least input? And to me, it's like when you build a project, how can you use the fewest parts and have it do the most? I guess if you were into building houses, you would think of architecture and lumber in the same sense I did. Well, I discovered this manual called a Small Computer Handbook while I was programming that computer at Sylvania. So I brought home the Small Computer Handbook, and it described a computer, digital equipment PDP-8, described the registers and instruction sets and how the ones and zeros flowed in the machine. And then I thought, you know, from all my little projects back in elementary school with logic gates and stuff that I was so interested in for the rest of my life, I wonder if I can combine them together and make this computer. So I started sitting down on paper with pencil. I would close my door, nobody in the room, maybe turn on some music, and I was in you know, junior and senior in high school, and I'd start trying to design this computer, the PDP-8. And I didn't quite get there. And then a few weeks later, I tried it again on a weekend. And I got virtually the whole thing designed, I think. I could never test it. You could never afford the parts. My design might be 100 chips, and a single chip might cost $50 back then, which is probably like, I don't know, $500 today. So there's no way a human could afford to build this thing. So then I discovered that I loved it so much, I found a way to get manuals for all of the mini computers that were coming out in the late 1960s. They were coming out from companies like Varian, companies like Hewlett-Packard, companies like Digital Equipment, companies like Data General, and others. I would go down to where there was a great technical library, and that was Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. I'd drive down on a weekend because nobody would be around, and then real smart people work there. Wherever smart people work, they leave doors unlocked. And I would sometimes have to climb upstairs, but eventually I'd find a door unlocked, go through some entrance and get to the library. And in the library, I could read computer magazines, sort of in the dark, and I could tear out little cards and mail them in, and they would send me the manuals for various computers. So I loved it. Every time I got a manual, I studied it and saw how this computer was slightly different than the other mini computers of the day. I mean, every mini computer boiled down to a big rectangular metal box with switches and lights and some colors going on, and they looked like they belong in the network area, they belong in the computer area. They're just not the sort of thing a normal human being would approach. But I loved these things. And I would sit down on my paper alone some weekend and design each of those computers. Now that was fun, and it got me more and more skills at being able to do the job better, designing with fewer parts. I never read a book that said, here's how you design a computer. I simply thought out, if these are the pieces I have, what are the best ways to design a computer? It was a much better way to learn. Then I sort of had free weekends, and I said, I wonder if I could design the same computer, the PDP-8, would use fewer parts. I made a little game. I made a game. It's like anybody might think of a little game in their life. I do this, now I'm going to try to do it a little better. I can hit the tennis ball 20 times against the garage door without losing it. Maybe I can make it to 30. Maybe I can make it to 50. So I started making my goal to design these computers in fewer and fewer parts. And I developed all sorts of little tricks in my head and skills and methods, using chips designed for one thing for another purpose just to get the chip count very low. And I was getting very successful at this. I knew I was good because my designs had half as many chips as the companies that sold the computers. And I was still in high school.
Yeah.
And I was just doing it on my own, just for fancy. I didn't get a title. I didn't get anything you can see. I didn't get a lot of money and yachts and houses. I didn't get prestige. I didn't get awards. I didn't get a salary. All I got was the knowledge in my head that I was beating my last attempt at the same problem. So that little game made me develop incredible skills that just couldn't even be written into a book. Yeah. Just ways of looking and spotting, the ways to design a product that'll do the complete job. One day, I went and designed a new computer called the Data General Nova. And this was a strange computer. It had a different architecture than everything else. You think about a house with a very different architecture. When I was done, it took half as many parts to make that computer. And I was shocked. The architecture of the computer had been designed around the chips that existed, and they had tailored the computer to that rather than defining a computer on its own and figuring out a way to build it with chips. And I liked that. I said, this computer takes half as many chips. To me, that was supreme. That was the supreme God. I told my dad at the end of high school, I'm going to have a Data General 4K Nova computer someday, because 4K is enough of a computer to run a program on. I told him I'm going to have one someday, and he said it costs as much as a house. And I sat for a second and I said, I'll live in an apartment. So I guess that was a big argument with my dad. But I was destined to have a computer somehow, someday in my life.
But to underscore, because it's a foundation of so much that followed, this art, really, of being able to simplify down was really a big differentiating factor for you as...
Yes, the art was a skill, but also the respect for it. Wanting to design things with very few parts is like wanting to design something in an excellent fashion. And I'll tell you, if you're competing yourself to do an excellent job, there's nothing that's going to make you work 40 hours a week. You're going to work, 80, 100 hours. All your time. I used to go to sleep thinking of problems in my computer designs or problems in my math classes. I'd go to sleep thinking about them, wake up in the middle of the night and have a solution. And after I forgot it one morning, I learned to write them down. And it worked. You're just dreaming the whole thing. And
but it's interesting the way your mind works to do that.
I don't know. I felt when something had fewer parts and fewer wires, I could look at the design on a piece of paper and follow exactly what happened. As tricky as I had been and complicated, it was very simple steps, and I could understand it better. And if I ever could get the parts to build it, I wouldn't have to solder as many wires. So it'd be easier to build. And I was lazy. I told everyone I was lazy.
Yeah. When did you first meet Steve Jobs?
After my second year of college, and I had a couple of great first years of college, I took... Somebody's read the book. The TV Jammer. Well, electronics has to have an element of fun in it. If you can't laugh what you're doing, you're not having as good a life as you could.
Tell the TV Jammer story.
TV Jammer, sure. Went off to the University of Colorado my freshman year. I went there because I went out to visit the college and it snowed. I'd never been in snow in my life. Tromping around there just made the whole thing so beautiful. It's the only college I would apply to. I had 800s on all the math and science SATs except chemistry, and could have applied to some top tech schools in the country, but no, that was where I wanted to go. And while I was there, a friend's father had designed a little TV jammer, and I learned to build them. So I went to the Radio Shack and bought the highest speed transistor they had, wrapped some wire, like even coat hanger wire, around in a coil, and got a couple little resistors and capacitors on the back of a 9-volt battery. And when I tuned it in, it would jam a television. But I went over to the girls' dorm where they had a color television. At night, a lot of the guys would go over there and watch TV, and we had a room, and I'd sit in the back. And when I jammed it, it just fuzzed up the picture. So a friend of mine, sitting in the front row, waxed the TV, and I made it go good. and that was probably the first time in my life that I realized the humor of tricking people about what's really happening. So my friend would hit it harder and harder when it went bad, and I'd make it go good, and eventually they stationed people next to that TV for weeks, and it was the person's job sitting next to the TV to hit it, bang it, or adjust it until it went good. And then I started playing with their bodies, where they moved their bodies. If they put their hand up, it worked. And I once even got them to watch a half hour of Mission Impossible with a hand on the middle of the TV, and the guy was standing up with a leg up on a chair. If he put the leg down, it failed. And he turned to the audience and he said, "It's a grounding effect." So that was joyful, and they never once, ever, I was so good at this, they never once caught on that a person in the room was tricking and playing with them. Sometimes they'd kind of go up to hit the TV, and without hitting it, it would go good. But they never caught me.
So back to your first 2 years of college.
After the first 2 years, I took a year off to work programming a computer. I walked in the front door of a place building a mini-sized computer in Sunnyvale, and applied for a job. And I worked for a year to earn the money for my third year of college at Berkeley. And while I was working there, I told one of the executives how I used to design all these computers, back in high school, but I could never get the parts to build them. And he says, "Well, what if I get you the parts?" So he got me a set of parts for a computer that I designed, all my own, kind of a small computer. And I built it on a board with a friend, some switches and lights, and you could toggle into ones and zeros and push buttons, and the ones and zeros would go into memory, and you could run little sample programs. And you could call it a computer. It couldn't do anything useful, but it was the heart of a computer. And the friend that I wired it up with, Bill Fernandez, said, "You got to meet this guy, Steve Jobs." because he's interested in electronics, got a lot of experience in electronics, and he likes pranks like you do. Steve came over, and we just had a lot of fun sharing our prank stories at first, and then talking about some of the electronics projects that we had built and designed and what kind of chips each of us was familiar with. And it was odd to find anyone else in high school in those days that knew that sort of thing. So we became best friends for 7 years, Music was a big core of our life. Steve, I was more the centered person, like my father would describe a lot of the ends of life and the places you can go in life. And I decided I always wanted to be pretty much right in the middle, feet on the ground. I'm going to have a salary and a job and a home and a family and the normal things. Steve was more floating in the world and, go wind up where the wind goes, the barefoot, the real hippie type stuff, eating the seeds. And interesting, I think back, it never really comes out anywhere. I guess I'm the only person who ever talks about it. He talked to me about how he would film these claymation movies at the high school at night with some friends, where they move the pieces of clay a little bit for the next frame and move it a little for the next frame and make them animate. And now when you think about Pixar, it's such a...
Yeah.
it's such a... So many things in Steve's life. I see early stages of a design that we had at Apple and a reason for something. He'll stick with that reason in every product till the end. So it's, it comes back and forth. And Steve was a little bit like less money, able to hitchhike around and just meet other friends like himself and, find his way over to India and bathe in the Ganges River and that kind of stuff. But I was just going to be solidly here at home, going to college. So I drove Steve up eventually. I drove Steve up to college in Reed College in Portland, Oregon. Steve believed very much in following these very few people that are special in the world and really change the world and make it what it is, the Shakespeares of our time. And they had a Nobel Prize winner at Reed College. So he wanted to be near a place where there was a Nobel Prize winner. And I guess Stanford wasn't quite able to get in there. But I went up, took him up to Reed College, and he got a list of classes and he says, look what they're making me take. Well, I said, what do you expect? You take math and you take English, you take this, and that's what you take. And he says, no, but they have classes on Shakespeare, and they have classes on astrophysics, and they have classes on astronomy, and all these great little art things I want to get into, calligraphy. So he sat there and didn't go to any of his classes, and I thought, uh-oh, this is bad news. I don't know if his parents know. Somehow, though, he could talk his way into everything. So he talked him into letting him stay there for at least that year in the dorms without paying tuition. But he'd go to classes what he felt like. It's kind of like one of the better ways to learn. Too bad we don't set up society to have that as the standard way.